Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Space Talk. And today we have a real astronaut. We had Mike Mullane here, and we had Dan Bursch here. We had our own Ed Lu here. They were astronauts. They are, currently retired astronauts. This guy here is actually an astronaut. And he's a physicist. He was a mission specialist on 4 space shuttle flights. He logged in enough space flight time to go 35 times to the moon and back, and do 17 times the duration of the EVA of the Apollo 11. So he has some experience in working in space. And I think it's important to hear from people who have actually done something in space, because the way I see it, we gotta go to Mars sooner or later. And for you Google at politics people, please leave your questions for the very end if you are here in the audience. I know we had some discussions on where we should go next. So please welcome astronaut Jim Newman, and give him a warm welcome.
Just do a quick mic check. Can you hear me okay in the back? Okay? Oh, very good. Thank you. Well, it is a pleasure for me to be here today. Just to point out the ringer that I know in the audience, that is Ed Lu. Ed Lu, raise your hand. Ed Lu is your astronaut. And I also know that there are probably some of you in the audience who know some of this stuff better than I do. And if you have a correction or something, feel free to correct me in real time. I'll just say, OK, thanks. But also, since we're a small enough group, I'd encourage it to make it a conversation, a dialogue. So let's do that as we go. Boris suggested that I keep it technical, that you're a technical audience and that you'd really like to hear some of the technical side. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to combine that with some of the stories from spaceflight. There's not enough time today for me to tell all the stories that I'd like to share with you. I know you all are busy, too. So if you need to get up for any reason and go, that's fine. I do encourage people to vote with their feet. I only guarantee that I'll stop talking when the last person leaves. Until then, you're fair game. What I want to do is just to frame the talk today, and then also to give you an opportunity to help direct it. So if you do ask questions, if there are things you want to know about, even the hard questions, the political questions, feel free to ask those too. We get a little bit of media training, and we'll see if any of it is stuck over the years. So I'd like to think that we can at least have an honest discourse on whatever topic it is you'd like to talk about. What I want to cover are a few concepts, and we'll start with knowing your bureaucracy and what is worth fighting for. And since I'd never been here before, I just threw that up there because NASA is known as a bureaucracy. And then I got here and I was getting a little tour around, and then some certain things came up, like about how hard it is to get a new project plugged into the network, and about the security, so on and so forth. And I realized you have your own bureaucracy here. It's big enough that you're undoubtedly in a similar situation at some level. There's a huge emotional cost in certain bureaucracies for innovation. And I'll describe a little bit of that on the technical side. And there's also something that I call the weight of experience. Every time we have an accident, every time anybody has an accident, we all do something about it to make sure that won't happen again. And on the shuttle, I'll give some examples. On the Russian Soyuz, I'll give some examples. And then just to sort of to integrate in your own minds, and how does that mean anything for you here now? Because innovation is the only thing that's going to keep us moving forward. Situational awareness, why we call it that. And that has to do, again, with the technical side of things. In particular, critical operations, rendezvous, prox ops, robotics. These are all very technical. If you're orbital mechanics kind of people, we can go into as much detail as you'd like. And also spacewalks. This will come up again, why in critical situations in space, usually, and we tell this to the new spacewalkers in particular, the slower you go, the quicker you get there. It's often true in critical situations on Earth, too, of course. Now, if you're a spacewalker, and we call it spacewalking. Does anybody think we actually walk around in space, though, right? What do we do in space? Crawl. Okay, if you're lucky, you might get a ride on the arm, but most of the time, you're crawling. Space crawl doesn't sound very sexy. We call it spacewalking. If you are a spacewalker, be one with the suit. If you fight the suit will win. Okay, so there's a very, very real lesson there as well. Given the amount of time, if we have time towards the end, I'd also like to touch on Hubble Space Telescope. In addition to being on the first assembly mission for the International Space Station, on which Ed Lu lived for 6 months, I also got to do a Hubble Space Telescope repair mission, the most recent one in 2002. They're getting ready to do another one later this year. Also fascinating, Russian approaches to technical things. Are they cultural differences, or is it just a thinking out of our box? Again, I'll tell you a little bit about the Russian Soyuz, Russia, the Buran, which looks astonishingly like a space shuttle. And then finally, I have some slides on exploration and the current administration's plans for the future. Some of the slides, I threw a bunch in there, and some of them are just there because it's a visual experience. So I'll just bomb through some of them. If you see something you really want to go back to, let me know. But some of them, I just want to give you the visual flavor for what's going on. But first, I'm going to start off with the test. You're technical people. Perhaps some of you have gotten this email. Has anyone here gotten this email already? I'm teaching orbital mechanics at the Naval Postgraduate School. And I should stop. I appreciate the introduction I got. I'm a civilian all the way through, just like Ed Lu. There's a bunch of military guys in the astronaut office. 2/3 of them are military. 1/3 of us are straight civilian. I came out of Dartmouth and then went down to Rice University. Since I'm from California, originally 5 years in the Bay Area, my dad's a marine biologist down in Scripps. I ended up leaving and going to Houston with some trepidation, wondering if I could live in Texas. And I discovered after that I could. And so I did my PhD in physics down at Rice University in Houston, Texas, then went down to NASA. I worked actually as an instructor for a couple of years before I finally got into the astronaut program. I had to interview 4 times over 6 years and finally started in 1990. Ed showed up in 1992, as I recall. 95, sorry. He's a little younger than I thought. And I got a story for when Ed and I first met and worked together on campus at the NASA. But that's just a little bit of my background. I'm teaching orbital mechanics now down at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. And as people who are technical people, I wanted to share this with them. I think it's a fascinating photo. And this is what comes in. It comes in on an email from some friends of mine who like to send out emails. A scene you'll probably never get to see, probably because they mean that most of us aren't going to get to the North Pole. We know that that global warming, it's making it less and less ice. I wouldn't know where there's more and more mountains, but now this is the sunset at the North Pole with the moon at its closest point. You'll also see the sun below the moon, an amazing photo. Okay, and so anybody care to, except for my ringers up here, anybody care to hazard a guess as to this photo and when it was taken and where? Okay, in the back.
I don't know that, but I know which direction it was taken. The camera was pointing south.
If you're at the North Pole, then he would be right. Okay, well, I maintain if the mountains are that close, it's got to be like Greenland, right? So you're not really right at the North Pole, because that's just a bunch of water ice. Go ahead.
Well, the visible disk of the sun and the disk of the moon are the same size. At least they're supposed to be the same size.
So you're just zoomed in. You know how things, they get bigger in the picture when you zoom in on them. What he said was that the disk of the sun and the disk of the moon are the same size. And that's true. The apparent size of the sun and the apparent size of the moon are the same. We just had a lunar eclipse, right? And this would be a solar eclipse. We just had a lunar eclipse, which means the moon's on the other side on February 20th. So there's a real problem here. Go ahead.
The sun cannot be below the moon when viewed from the North Pole.
The sun cannot be below the moon when viewed from the North Pole. Does anybody believe that? Is that true? What is the plane of the ecliptic is the orbit of the Earth around the sun. So the sun is in the plane of the ecliptic. However, the moon has some obliquity. It has some obliquity. So could it not be above or below? In fact, it must be above or below, except when you have an eclipse. So I'd maintain that isn't what distinguishes this. Okay? But good, you're thinking. And basically, that's what we're here to do, is we're here to think a little bit. You see a picture like this, and by chance, I showed this to my orbital mechanics class yesterday. Last night, I got an email that said, guess what? In her email, showed up this picture. Should she write back and disappoint the sender? Well, because, but still, there's a question. When was this picture taken? When? This assumes that it's a current era, right? Because the moon and the, what's happening to the moon as it goes around the Earth? It's getting further away. So every year the moon's a little further away. So how many years ago could this picture have been taken? Okay, a couple of billion. Okay, we're suspecting that that's not the case. But so this is a fraud photograph. That's my only point. You see something that looks really cool, engaged brain, brain says, what's wrong? That's awfully small, it's supposed to be the same size as that, so on and so forth. And I'm sure the guy who's sending it out, I hope he's laughing as he sends it. A scene you'll probably never get to see. Right, I agree. This is a class of astronauts that showed up in 1990. And I'm one of the tall guys. The nice thing about the shuttle program is it allowed Americans up to 6'4" to be selected in the program. And the Apollo age was about 5'6" to 5'11". Guys were exactly Ed Lu's height. And as I was growing up, I was learning to slouch because I wanted to be like Ed Lu. Okay? Fortunately, they developed a shuttle program, and it goes from the 5th percentile short American woman, which is 5'0", to the 95th percentile tall American male, which is 6'4". So there are a few of us at that kind of close to the upper limit. They've only ever measured me at 6'2". Question? What are the Soyuz limits these days? Very good question. We put some money into the Soyuz to try to expand its envelope. And it goes from, I don't know the short side of it. Ed might know, 5'4", 5'5", sort of thing.
It's hard to add 5'2", probably.
Okay. So on the order of 5'2", he says. On the height size, it depends actually on a complex combination of your sitting height, your torso height, your leg length, your foot size. My feet are nominally too large. Size 12 is the largest you're supposed to have. I got a size 13. I got a man-sized foot. What's the problem with that, you know? But so they have some issue. I am considered too tall. And if they did, because I know when I got in without a suit into the Soyuz, I was head to butt without the suit or the liner. So I'd probably be too tall for the Soyuz. But it's close to that size. It's close to 6'1", 6'2".
Tallest is probably Sergei Krikalev.
Yeah.
6'1", maybe.
He's mentioned Sergei Krikalev, whom I'll also mention later. Interesting fellow. Okay, and then also just, and 23 of us, just to point out, Eileen Collins, the first woman commander of a space shuttle, she was a commander twice and ended up flying the shuttles and landing the shuttle. It's interesting that the pilots, and I'm not saying that there's a division between pilots and mission specialists or any kind of union, but the pilots, they are the commanders and they fly the ship, okay? And the most important thing they do on a shuttle flight is to land it on the ground at the end of the mission when you're not in space. But that's a very important job, and we're glad they're there because they don't trust autopilot. I, on the other hand, have a little bit of faith in computers. They're too valuable to go outside on spacewalks most of the time, too, so guys like Ed and I have to go do the spacewalks. One of the things you want to do when you're an astronaut is to be able to do your job regardless of how you feel. Now, guys who fly jets all the time, they sit in the front seat. Mission specialists will sit in the back. Got a full set of controls. And the guy in the front seat, if he ever says, watch this, do you know what to do? If the guy in the front seat says, watch this, tighten your seatbelt. Okay, you got a 5-point harness, so go ahead and tighten it down because something's going to happen. And you want to be ready for it so he doesn't smack it. These things can roll at 720 degrees a second. That's twice every second. And if you do that, then you can smack your helmet or his, if you catch him unaware, against the side of the cockpit there pretty quickly. Next slide, let's go on. You learn to do a whole lot of stuff. We have life rafts, we have parachutes, we've got what you need in order to survive. That brings me to my first point of the weight of experience. What happened in Challenger? We lost the crew, we lost a teacher, that was in 1986, and the first thing we did after that was during ascent, when the solid rocket boosters had a fatal problem in it, resulting in the loss of the crew in the vehicle. They gave us life rafts, pressure suits, which I'll show you, pressure suits, life rafts, parachutes, helmets so you could survive. And if something like that would happen again, the thought is we'd be trying to jump out. Okay, and you'd see parachutes coming down instead of just debris. We added also a slide pole, so we added a lot of weight, a pole that you could open the hatch, hook up your parachute to, jump out, open up. So we added all this weight. We added all this extra procedures. And they fixed the problem with the solid rocket boosters, and we've never needed any of that stuff. But we still have it. We use it, we fly it every mission. Then after Columbia, what happened in Columbia? They came apart on reentry because a piece of foam had hit them on the ascent, had cracked open the reinforced carbon-carbon, and so the hot gases were able to come in. And so we ended up losing that vehicle. And then after that, they said, well, what are we going to do about that? It's an unsurvivable scenario. So they want to inspect and make sure all the tiles are good and everything's good. So they put an inspection boom on this big, massive thing. They put in a lot of procedures to take photographs, spend a lot of time, the weight of experience. And again, the idea is that with something as expensive, $5 billion a copy, you go and you fix the problem, and then you don't have that problem, but you still have that weight. So we're now actually borne down by the weight of having made these mistakes in the past, and now we actually have less payload capability, less time on orbit capability, and stuff like that. So it's how do you balance risk against performance, against loss? And it's a fundamental question for organizations that deal with large quantities of things. When you're betting your entire space agency, every shuttle flight, we had thought we'd be shut down if Columbia were to have happened. And that was the way we went to work every day. If something like this happens again, we're going to be shut down. But because we were an international program, building an international space station, we actually couldn't abandon it right away. So the space shuttle still flies, and will fly through 2010 in order to fulfill our international commitments. And it's probably the only reason it's still flying. So it's, again, very, very interesting. On the one hand, technical risk. On the other hand, NASA is an instrument of national and international policy, and is certainly used as such by every administration. Spacewalks are a lot of fun. They're a lot of work. You train in a big swimming pool. It's 40 feet deep, a couple hundred feet long. Shamu from SeaWorld would be right at home in it. It's a little bigger than his tank. One of the things that we do is we get to make our own patches, and I'll show you a couple of those. This one was my first flight. It turns out that these four guys are the military guys on the flight, and I was the token civilian. I was there to kind of keep an eye on them. And Carl Waltz is a mild-mannered Air Force officer, but you give him a microphone and a little bit of music, and his collar goes up, and he turns into Elvis. So I have actually seen Elvis in space, okay? Just wanted to make sure you knew that, as far as I'm concerned, Elvis lives. He sang at my wedding. At the time, I was a single guy, and before my next flight, I got married, and he sang at it. Elvis is alive and well. We do hide things in patches, too, by the way, which I'll share with you in a minute. Question?
So why do you have the Orion constellation?
Orion here, the ostensible purpose for, the question is why do we have Orion? And there is meaning to just about everything in a patch. This is the German ultraviolet telescope that we partner with the Germans on, advanced communication technology satellite using Ka spot beaming instead of just broadband Ku. And then Orion ostensibly represents the constellations and stars, hot gases, that this ultraviolet telescope is going to look at. But it was also because Frank Culberson was a good friend of the Challenger crew. It's also, you'll notice there are 7 stars, and there were 7 crew member on Challenger. So it was a tribute to the Challenger crew as well. Just to share with you launch day, and again, this is just an anecdote, nothing technical here, but on launch day, you'd suit up in these special suits now that we have. I don't know, did anybody here happen to follow a year ago, there was a little incident where one of our people had a little problem in Florida. So it's no surprise, everybody knows that we wear diapers, okay? So under these big, fortunately, you know, the big baggy suit, you can't really tell. My feeling about the diaper is that, and if you aren't familiar with it, ask your buddy next to you. I'm sure they follow the news. But you're sitting on your launch pad for up to many hours. And for me, it's like a parachute. You want to have one, or you just don't want to use it, okay? Why do we have them? Well, you go back to Alan Shepard. They put that man on a rocket, our first American to go into space. They put him on his back, they left him in there, and then they started working the problems, one after the other and the other. And he was in that place on his back for like many, many hours. He was fully instrumented with biometrics, because they're going to measure everything about this first human, American human, going into space. What happened? Well, he had to let loose. And that electrolyte, as it flowed, she's on his back, it shorted out a bunch of those biometric sensors. They didn't get quite as much data as they thought they were going to. Time to go. There's always some senior astronauts to come with you, some management folk on the way out to the launch pad. As you drive out to the launch pad, you notice that it gets pretty deserted. Pretty soon you're the only people on the road. Pretty soon you're the only people within 3 miles. And you think about that, that's the blast damage area. If the thing just blows up on the pad, it's can take out everything out to about 3 miles. So that's as close as you're allowed to get. On the way out there, the senior astronaut, at least they did on my flights, I don't know about Ed's, but on my flight, the senior astronaut said, with some amount of respect, and again, it's a multicultural organization, but they said, we'd just like to have a moment and say the astronaut's prayer. We're on our way out to go into space on a $5 billion vehicle, often with $1 billion worth of payload. The whole world's going to be watching. The astronaut's prayer was very simple. We bowed our heads the first time. I wasn't sure what he was going to say, but I was very respectful. And he said, "Dear God, don't let us screw up." It's a very simple concept. And so we appreciated that. And then the manager who was there, senior manager, said, "That's all fine and good, but now I'd like to share with you the manager's prayer for the astronaut." And so we looked at him, and we noticed he wasn't bowing his head. He was looking us right in the eye, and he said, "God help you if you screw up." It was very clear which side of the law he was on. One of the first things I got to do when I got there, this is in 1993. I was selected in 1990. I'd already had 5.5 years at NASA, so I knew some of the system. What we have here are laptop computers. And at that time, they were running DOS. 1993, right? These were 386s. I know there's a lot of young people in the audience. I think that's great, but I see there's a few people who might remember a 386 as well, okay? It was a great thing at the time. The interesting thing about a space shuttle is it runs on a computer that is directly derived from nuclear submarines. And you think, nuclear subs? Ah, nuclear subs space. What do they have in common? Radiation environment. What does radiation do to electronics? It can cause upsets. Now, I was personally acquainted with this because I'd heard stories in the office before I flew, and I'd been told that sometimes if you close your eyes right before you go to bed, you'll actually see a little spark of light when it's completely dark. And they said, hey, that's your optic nerve getting hit by cosmic rays. And I said, okay, great, I'll look for that. And I didn't see it on my first flight, but I finally got to a high inclination flight. In a high inclination flight and high altitude, you get more radiation. And one night, before I went to bed, before I was fully asleep, I dark adapted. All of a sudden, I see a bright flash of light in my eyes. They'd been closed. And so not only does radiation upset the hardware, it goes after the software, too. Okay, and so you can actually, when it stimulates that optic nerve. So that really made a believer out of me. Before that, the effect I'd seen of radiation was in these laptop computers. We actually, at night, we'd write ones and zeros to the memory, and then we'd have a little program that just went back and read them all night long. And I did it on the ground just to assure myself of what it meant, and there were no upsets for 3 weeks of running. Then none of the bits ever changed. I got in space every 9 hours, approximately, on average. It would find a bit flip. So radiation is real, and it's a real part of your life there, and of course it's going to play a big deal into going on to Mars someday. You wouldn't want to trust your life to a 386 computer, but there's a whole lot of things it can do that will help you, and that's called situational awareness. We actually, on this flight, were the first time we actually managed to connect our computers to the space shuttle computers as a listen-only data port. The shuttle computers at that time had 128K of RAM. The program was written in HAL, appropriately named, And it's the best software ever written. If anybody does software, you've heard of, what is it, CMM level 5. It is the type of stuff they use in nuclear reactors and the space shuttle. The code is huge, and they actually know their process so well that when they do a new software release, they can tell you how many bugs to expect within quite tight error band. And if they don't find as many as they expect, they know they've missed some and they go looking. Their processes are that well known. There's no way we were going to get in such a, it's very tight, and it's actually 5 computers running, 4 computers running the exact same software, and 1 computer that's actually running backup flight software written by a different vendor, just on the off chance that these 4 could have a software glitch that would result in a potentially fatal problem. So the commander has a little button he can push, which will actually result in this backup computer taking over the whole space shuttle. So there's, when you're working with that kind of money, that's a worthy sort of thing to do. So you end up with this very tight computer, very difficult to upgrade, very difficult to change the software. But what we finally let them give us was a data feed, because all of the data, the telemetry from the shuttle goes down on the ground. They had mainframe computers that would decommutate it and plug it into the flight controller's workstations. Well, there was a guy who had written some software in assembler that could do the same thing in a 386 computer that they were doing on the ground. And so I found that guy, found a data port, got some guys to give us some money, and we ended up with our own little mission control center on orbit, which scared the hell out of the flight controllers. So if you've ever worked with bureaucracy, now flight controllers are in charge of the space shuttle and the data. The flight director is actually the boss of the mission. The commander thinks he is, and he is when he's upstairs. He's the on-site representative, and he's responsible for our safety. But we all have a boss, and that person is the flight director. They were actually scared to give us that data because they want to know what we were going to do with it. They figured nothing good. Just anything we needed to know, they could tell us. The first thing we got on here, actually, one of the first things we got was a feed to the world map of the state vector. The state vector is your position, your velocity, and your time. Why is that important? Well, if you ever look out the window of a space shuttle, and there are some people who can actually see a bit of dirt on the ground, and they know right where they are over the Earth. I cannot, okay? But if I have a map with a ground track on it, and it shows them over South America, I can tell you where I am. And when you're talking to the press, to the public affairs people, it's always handy, because they always ask you, where are you right now? And so one of my commanders once said, oh, we're over Africa. I looked at the world map and said, Australia. Okay, so it's a handy thing. It saved us from typing in all that data just to tell the computer where we were. But it's a fascinating thing is because bureaucracies, they move, they have procedures, and they work, and they don't want to change them. And if you're working in that environment, innovation is hard, and there's a huge emotional cost to pay. I took so many arrows and spears trying to get this capability because it was clear they knew what we were going to use it for. We were going to actually try to get enough situational awareness that it might be possible someday to not need the ground and maybe go back to the moon or onto Mars. And they were having none of that, not with the space shuttle, okay? So it was very, very interesting from the point of view of growing our organization to be ready. We ended up actually using it for some very useful things. If you've ever done any orbital mechanics, you know that if you're going to rendezvous with the International Space Station, the first thing you do, the space station's going around, when the plane of the space station basically goes over your longitude, when it goes overhead, you've got to launch your shuttle into it. Because if you're in different orbits, you can't ever get there. There's too much delta V velocity change required. So on a rendezvous, you want to get in and you get behind the space station at some distance, and then you want to be in the same orbit. Oh, but now you're behind it. How do you catch up? Well, you probably know that if you slow down in space, you speed up on average. So you slow down to catch up, and you speed up, put you in a higher orbit, longer period, slow down on average, then you slow down to fall behind. So we have to do these things, and it's not intuitive. In fact, the first guys who did a rendezvous in space found themselves in big trouble. They almost didn't make it back to the rendezvous point because they got off in a certain quadrant where it's really hard to get out of. That quadrant has a name now, Cooper's quadrant or something, I forget. But so these are situational awareness tools that we can put on computers that allow us to understand our environment better. I'd just like to share with you, on my first flight, I had the opportunity to go on a spacewalk. And so I was standing out. There I am on a spacewalk. There I am on a foot restraint. So I'm not crawling now. I've crawled over there. I've gotten my feet in, and I'm standing there. And what I'm doing is I'm testing some tools for the Hubble Space Telescope repair mission. Back in December 1993, they put the specs on the Hubble when it finally got good vision. And we were testing those tools and techniques. This picture went down to the ground. My older brother saw it and talked to the local newspaper, and he told them I was space surfing. I did grow up in California, in San Diego. And so I saw this newspaper article, and it said, when I got home, I saw it, and it said, Newman is space surfing. And I talked to my brother, because I knew immediately what had happened, and I said, yo, bro, I never said that. And he said, yeah, but it made a good story. So a few months later, Surfer Magazine called me up. And I don't know what your class rank was in high school, okay, but I was not. They give letters for academics these days. They didn't when I was going to high school, so I was not a letterman. But in any event, I talked to my PAO, public affairs people, and they said, oh, we don't normally do interviews with Surfer Magazine. And so I said with a straight voice, I have a straight face and a calm voice, because I really wanted to do this interview, I said, but it's a serious interview. And they said, oh, okay, go ahead. And so I got to be interviewed for Surfer Magazine, and in March of 1995, on page 93, in case anyone has an old copy, I made Surfer Magazine. I'm sharing the page. Okay, it's a little nerdy title, but hopefully that doesn't go over poorly here. Brains Who Surf. It was not my choice, but I'll go with it. I was 36, and I'm sharing the page with two men of real distinction, two Nobel laureates, Donald Cram and Kary Mullis. A friend of mine from high school wrote me a letter. He said, Jim, I heard you'd become an astronaut. I'd graduated from high school 18 years earlier. He said, I heard you'd become an astronaut, and I thought that was okay. But then I saw you made Surfer Magazine, and I had to write, congratulations. I think we all know that our high school peers are probably our harshest critics. So I was actually elated. I tell people when I go to talk to high schools and other places not to peak too young. But I do point this out. When you do peak, at least acknowledge it. I peaked on that flight, my first space flight, back in 1993. And it's been downhill ever since, because I haven't made it back to Surfer Magazine. What is that? Anybody care to guess? Reentry. Yeah. And it's actually not even all that long an exposure, because the shuttle goes bombing by. This is a shuttle reentry. When everything works right, shuttle comes in, glows really hot like a shooting star, bombs across the sky, early morning Houston, this one, and ends up landing at the Kennedy Space Center or out at Edwards. Those of us working there knew that reentry was dangerous, especially if you'd looked out the window, because what you see out the window is a hot plasma glow surrounding the space shuttle and then coming together in a tail behind you. The world found that out when Columbia occurred. Now, what's hidden in this patch, for example? First of all, I will give a patch, and every once in a while I have to actually do this. When I'm talking to third graders, every once in a while they'll actually know what constellations these are. Okay? This flight was STS-69. 69. So we hid that in the patch. And you have to be a little careful with that number, but what it really is I don't know what you're thinking, but this is a hurricane or a constellation. It turned out a hurricane actually caused our space shuttle to have to roll back from the pad into the protection of the vehicle assembly building 2 months before our flight. So we ended up delaying by a couple of months. And then these are a couple of the constellations that do have meaning. Anybody care to hazard a guess? Pleiades, no? Okay, again, I was told technical audience, so now math in public, I'm going to throw a math in public question at you in a minute. So be ready for that one as well. If you know this one or hazard a guess, feel free to come up later. We started off on the first assembly mission with 5 crew members, and then they finally figured out, oh, we're partners with the Russians, aren't we? So Krikalev got to go. Unfortunately, Krikalev was added like 3 or 4 months prior to flight, and so I didn't lose one of my spacewalks, because he was hot after one of my spacewalks. And fortunately, he was added so late he didn't get it. Otherwise, I think he would have. Krikalev is the fellow who was up on the Mir space station on his first space flight. His first space flight was to Mir for 5 months. Happened to be in, what was about 1990, 1991. And they had a little problem over there in the Soviet Union, kind of disintegrated and became Russia. The story goes a couple of different ways, but one way it goes is they called him from the ground and said, "Yo, Sergey, some trouble down here. Would you mind staying an extra 5 months?" So his first space flight went from 5 to 10. His next space flight was another 5 months. And then he had a shuttle flight. So he had 15 months of spaceflight experience when he went with us to help start the construction of the International Space Station. Needless to say, he'd been in orbit for a while. There's the NASA logo. That's Zarya in Russian, Cyrillic. There's Proton. And there's an American flag on a Russian rocket. A very neat sight to see. That put the first thing up there. We went up there in the space shuttle a couple of weeks later and rendezvoused with it. Here's all the flags of the organizations involved. And there's Sergey. Sergey, since that time, has been to the International Space Station twice, 6 months each. He's got over 800 days in space. He's the human with the most spaceflight. And people say, you know, how does that, wear on a person, okay? And my understanding is that he's fine. When I meet him, he looks fine. From the women who've met him, they tell me he looks fine. So I guess it's not hurting him any. Here's that math in public question. This is a sunrise or a sunset. If you're going around low Earth orbit, it's about 90-minute orbit, give or take, a few minutes. That means every about 45 minutes you got daylight, and 45 minutes you're behind the Earth, so you got dark. 45 minutes day, 45 minutes dark. So every 45 minutes there's a sunrise or a sunset. They're beautiful. Okay, they go by really fast, but it's okay if you miss one because there's another one coming right up. How many sunrises and sunsets are there in a 24-hour day? How many sunrises and sunsets are there in a 24-hour day? And if anybody cares to do math in public, feel free to. 32. Anybody else? I heard another 30 something out there. Okay. In the back.
How are you counting the day?
24 hours. Solar day. 24 solar hours, not sidereal. 32 it is. Yeah. Good job. You get 16 orbits in 24 hours because they're an hour and a half, so 16 times an hour and a half is 24 hours. So you got 2 sunrise, sunset every time. So good job. What's that? Yeah. If you have just the right orbit, if your orbit is actually basically face onto the sun, you might never have sunset. But if you're basically in a quasi-normal orbit, then you'll get some period of dark. That's how we left it. Smiling, work to do. Just a quick one here. Now this is a little bit of a physics lesson, if you'll permit me to add this in here. And that is, this is the control block. It was a little more crowded when you were there, I think, right, Ed? I kind of used it for storage, is my understanding. But when we got there, it was this long corridor. Now the concept is this: position and momentum. Angular momentum and energy, they're all conserved, right? We know that those are conserved quantities. Is position conserved? No. If you take a cat, an example of that is if you take a cat and hold it, and I'm not saying I've ever done this, but if you hold one upside down and you drop it, okay, it's not rotating, it's still. It means it has no angular momentum. You drop that cat, it will somehow flip over and land on its feet. But it had no angular momentum at any time in there. So that means it had to kind of shift its body around in such a way that it could change its position without any angular momentum. And so a cat can, now it turns out that there's actually a minimum height you could drop a cat from, okay, and it wouldn't have time to actually land on its feet. But that's a different experiment. So it turns out that if a cat can do that, then a person can. And what Sergey did is he did 2 things. This is a long corridor. There's Sergey. And Sergey said to me, he said, "Watch this." Okay, so I got out of the way. He positioned himself on the aft end cone there, and he pushed off. And he did the Superman thing all the way down that corridor and didn't touch the sides, all the way down. And he said, now, Amerikansky, you try. Okay? Now, he'd had a lot of time in space, and I'm thinking they didn't actually do a lot of science on the Mir space station. Okay? Because he was really good at that, and he knew his geography really well, too, which tells me he spent most of his time, he knew American geography better than I did. He spent a lot of time looking out the window, okay? Because there was only 2 of them on board the Mir for some of those long duration, 2 or 3, and they just, you know, had a lot of time. So it took us a little bit of practice, but we were soon doing the Superman thing, too. And as soon as we had that under control, he said, okay, now try this. And he turns out, Sergei is the Soviet Union aerobatic champion, okay, for small airplanes. So he does the Superman thing down there, and then he does this really funny roll with his stomach and his arms, and the next thing you know, he did a perfect 90-degree turn. And he's going sideways, not touching the walls. He does this roll thing again, and he's upside down. He does it all the way around 360, okay? And that was a little bit harder. I won't tell you our success rate on that. But then I realized that I could try an experiment. And I said, Sergei, come help me, please. This is Nancy Curry. She is 5'0". So she just made it in. She's an Army helicopter pilot as well. Army helicopter pilot, 5'0". What kind of sense of humor do you think she had? But she is willing to do experiments in space. So I said, Nancy, we want to try to do a scientific experiment. So I took her with Sergei, and we very carefully put her in the middle of this. It's called the node, the cornerstone of the space station. We put her right in the middle, and we let go of her very carefully so she wasn't moving at all. So it'd be like taking someone here and putting you right in the middle, and then we let go and backed away. What do you think happened to her? She had nothing with her. She was stuck. She couldn't touch the walls. You can't swim because you need bigger paddles. You can't really swim effectively. And blowing, that's not going to work either. So she was stuck there for a couple of minutes. We have this on video, okay? She did the cat thing as well. That didn't help because it just turned her around. It didn't get her any closer. But we hadn't done a perfect job. There was a little bit of residual velocity. So she slowly kind of drifted over to the side and finally grabbed a hold of the handrail. And I said to her, we'd like to try again because we thought we could do better, and she wouldn't let us. It was in the name of science. It grew and grew and grew, and that's about what it's like now. Let's see, when Ed was there, that was it, right? A little bigger. A little smaller than that, a little bigger than that. Somewhere in the middle. Now it's huge. Been doing a lot of work on it. It's going to have one more. It's going to look like that, one more solar array. We got the European module up. Half of that European module is American, by the way, because we launched it, they built it, we launched it. So half of it's ours. Same thing with the Japanese module. You can go outside and see the space station sometime. Now just a quick one on to the Hubble flight. In the interest of time, I'm going to press on. It's very difficult to get crews, it used to be, when there weren't very many shuttle flights, to get them to agree to put your mission number on the patch. For a while, there were rules against it. People didn't like to do it. I really wanted to have our mission number, which was STS-109, on the patch. And some of the crew didn't want to do it. I finally convinced him, because he's a technical guy. And the way I convinced him was, I said, well, what are we doing? We're going to go fix Hubble. What does Hubble do? It looks at the stars, looks at galaxies. And who was famous for making that a popular thing to do? Who really popularized a lot of astronomy? Who was that? Carl Sagan. What did Sagan say?
Billions and billions.
You see, that's not a straight line, is it? That 9 is up a little bit, okay? And by hiding 10 to the 9th, which only a scientist or an engineer can really appreciate, he said, okay, we'll do it, okay? So there's the representative billions and billions, and there's the billions right there. So we got it in there. There is also some other things hidden on this patch, in particular in Florida and Canada, but you'd have to have a high-res version to see it. And if you were to do so, I would be glad to take a few minutes and explain to you what else is hidden there. We enjoyed putting Nancy right next to Scooter. She didn't seem to think it was funny, but we liked it. The spacewalkers on the outside, these are the military guys, the military folk who were responsible for the flying the shuttle, getting us there, getting us home. Just a quick mention of Scooter. Has anybody here seen, just out of curiosity, that movie Top Gun? Yeah. Okay. How many of you were as shocked as I was to learn that Tom Cruise wasn't actually flying those jets? Okay. I mean, my understanding is he was getting paid a lot of money, but he wasn't actually flying those jets. It turns out there were 4 young Navy lieutenants who were flying those jets, and Scooter, Scott Altman, was one of them. And he had done that back when the movie was filmed. If you ever watched the movie, he told us where he was in the movie. Because when the young woman instructor was instructing that bunch of rowdy pilots, he's one of the pilots that walks in and gets to sit down in the back. And so we watched the movie together. I actually brought it to space with us so we could watch it on our off time. And he pointed out when he was on the movie. He enjoyed it. By chance, it turns out that Tom Cruise, has anybody seen the 3D IMAX space station film? Okay, 3D IMAX space station. If you ever have a chance to see that, it is worth watching. It's fantastic. Tom Cruise narrated that. And this was before he did the jumping on the couch thing and was clearly a little bit out there. But he's a very hard worker. He's very professional. He came to NASA in order to learn about NASA to do a good job of narrating that film. And he came and visited us before our Hubble flight while we were training in the simulator. So depending on the time, I've actually got a little film clip I can show you later about that. But Hubble, here's a photo montage. This is Columbia in 2002. It was the last flight before its final flight in 2003. That's Columbia on its way to the pad. Just to note, because I'm going to go, looks like perhaps a little late if people have the time and interest. I'm going to talk some about the Russian program as well and contrast some of what we do with some of what they do. What are cultural differences? What is just different ways of thinking about things? And if you look at how we do things, we clearly integrate in the vertical, and then we roll it out on this very special roller, which had actually the Apollo moon rockets on it many years previously. You want the launch pad to not get immersed if the tide gets really high during a hurricane or something, so they build the launch pads up. Plus, you got to get rid of all that exhaust, so they build these flame pits as well. So this thing here, this is, I think, without fuel in it, it's only about 3 million pounds. They add about 1 million pounds of liquid fuel to it once you're out there. So this is only about 3 million. The whole thing's about 11 million. But you can't really afford to have this thing going back and forth because these are the nuts that hold the bolts that hold the shuttle to the mobile launch platform. And so from an engineering point of view, just look at the size of the nut. And obviously, this is half of it because you have to unscrew this thing really fast, okay, when you want to launch. So very difficult to do that any way except using pyrotechnics. So I'll talk a little bit about how we do that as well. And the question for the engineers here, why is there so much metal there? Clearly, the pyrotechnics takes up a whole bunch of that fill there. So you clearly don't need that much metal. And it's really heavy, and things are supposed to be as light as possible when you go into space. So I asked the engineers one day why they're so heavy. Think about that for a few minutes, and we'll get back to that at launch time. And if I forget to, just please remind me. So this thing is going up. You can't afford to have it tilting. So they actually keep that platform perfectly level as it goes up that ramp. So they have some hydraulic actuators in there to just beat the band. This thing actually has a top speed of 1 mile an hour. I've driven it. Full speed. It uses a laser docking system to get to within 1/4 of an inch on the launch pad of where it's supposed to be each flight. Okay, there it is. It's time to go, and up we went. Anyone care to hazard a guess why these things are so thick? But feel free.
oriented, so that the strong part is taking the forward and backwards loads, and the weak part side to side?
Okay, that's actually a great idea. I don't believe so. Okay, over there.
Yeah, I believe for firing until it's released.
Well, it turns out this little skinny bit of metal here is enough to hold it down, because it holds it down, because you have to fire the engines first. You actually fire your main engines on this baby first, just to make sure they're working that day. So you got your 3 main engines, you got your solid rocket boosters on the side. The 3 main engines give you about 1 million pounds of thrust. The whole stack weighs 4 million. So you're not going to go anywhere with the light the mains. However, the solid rocket boosters, those things on each side there, those things put out 2 3/4 million pounds of thrust each. So when those things light, you're going to go somewhere. You just hope it's up, okay? And you want these things to release really fast, okay? They say if one of these doesn't release, the shuttle is going to just strip it. They say if 2 of them don't release, it's still going to, well, it might leave a little piece of something behind on the launch pad, but it's still going up somewhere, but something will get left behind. So why is this thing so thick? Well, I couldn't figure it out. I'm not a mechie guy. And go ahead.
So it won't be thrown too far?
So it won't be thrown too far. They actually encapsulate it, so it won't be thrown at all. They put a encapsulation around it, so it won't be FOD. You don't want it flying around. This is stainless steel, okay? This is stainless. Metal is really strong. However, you notice there's 2 parts where it's blown. They have 2 pyros in it. Well, redundancy says you got to have 2. Redundancy says it needs to crack even if only 1 blows. So the whole reason for this is to transmit the shock. If one of them blows, it transmits the shock around to the other one and cracks it. If it was thinner, this thing might just clamshell open and then hang up on the threads. So that's the whole. So they're thinking. Those guys are thinking about this when they build this stuff. You're welcome to come up afterwards and take a look at that. Up we went. While we were in space, it turns out on my first space flight, I told you I had flown with Elvis, and I'd also flown with a guy named Dan Bursch. They flew together again on their 4th space flight, and they went on to the International Space Station. They were at Expedition 4, and they were up there for 6 months, actually. Their return was delayed. Their commander, Yuri Oniferenko, there's Oniferenko there, there's Elvis, there's radar. He liked to take pictures, and he liked big cameras. So I think that's 800 millimeter with doubler or something total. Ed probably knows. 400 with doubler, total of 800 millimeter. And it turns out if you're up there, you can get pretty good at matching the rotation of the Earth. And some of the guys get like meter resolution kind of shots of the ground. And Yuri was taking a picture one day, and he caught this shuttle launch of some guys on their way to Hubble. And there you can see the contrail once we're above the clouds and the shadow. So they were going by at about 240. The shuttle program still uses English units. Everybody's familiar with the nautical mile, right? You know how many newtons a slug is, right? Okay. So we were up at, the station's up about 240 nautical miles, about 400 kilometers. The Hubble Space Telescope is up about 320 nautical miles, about 600 kilometers. So the Hubble is up about 50% higher, so 1.5, and you know that the area of things goes as r squared. So if you're up at a Hubble altitude, you actually see twice as much area of the Earth as if you're down low, like at a station altitude. I'm not saying it's bad at a station altitude, but the view is actually much better at a Hubble altitude. And I'm not saying that it's a competition with my buddy Dan Bursch, okay? But we could see all of North America in one shot. On the station flight, Sergei Krikalev, the guy who'd spent a whole bunch of time up there, he pointed out Antarctica to us, which you can just see from a station flight, but we could not see it from Hubble. So there's this and that and the other thing. So in Hubble, I was responsible for putting in the advanced camera for surveys. If anybody has a digital camera, we put one into the Hubble. 16 megapixel digital camera in 2002, cost $70 million and weighed 800 pounds. And our digital camera. And we, in 0 gravity, pick it up slowly. 800 pounds is 800 pounds, and you'll squish your pinky, okay, if you run that thing into something. But then just move it over carefully. The whole idea was to be able to do our jobs without breaking anything. Question in the back?
What are the gold blankets all over?
What are the gold blankets? Thermal insulation. When you're looking at the sun, it's kind of like a hot fire on a winter's night. When you're looking at the sun, you get really hot. When you're looking at deep space, you get really cold. So the suit is actually spec'd for like plus or minus 100 degrees C, plus or minus a couple hundred degrees Fahrenheit. So you have to be able to operate in those environments. When you're looking at the Earth, it's kind of neutral warm. But you don't always spend your time doing that. So they have to have the right kind of insulation on these things in order to keep the temperatures right. And all these things up here, it's also multi-layer insulation. It does two things. One of the things it does is it protects against micrometeorites. Another thing it does is give you thermal conditioning. Micrometeorites, has anybody heard of orbital debris? Okay, well, you know, a couple of large countries have recently made some orbital debris. We argue that the orbital debris we made won't last very long. The orbital debris that was made by another country about a year ago is going to last for a long, long time. It comes home to you when if you look at the communication satellite of this communication dish, it has a lot of digital data, they're called pictures, that it needs to send to the ground. So it has 2 of these KU band dishes. You know, they're a dish about, I don't know, something like this big, on that order, made out of fiberglass kind of material with the right kind of coatings on it. And one of them has a neat little hole punched in it, about the size of a silver dollar, okay, right through the dish. And it's like, wow, when did that happen? And if it had been over 2 meters, it could have gone right through the telescope, and we'd have had no more Hubble. So there is debris in space, and it does hit stuff. We were really glad, okay, because we didn't screw up that day. So this is after our spacewalk, my spacewalking buddy Mike Massimino. We're wearing our thermal underwear. It's got the tubes of water sewn in it, and it keeps us warm, cools us off, so that we can work outside. Just a quick story. You never know how your teachers are going to affect you in your life, okay? And this was actually a touching moment because this was at the end of all 5 spacewalks, and we had fixed the Hubble. It's still good. It's still going 6 years later now, and it's got to last just about a whole another year before they get to it, and then refurbish it to last hopefully another 5 or 10. And so we'd done 5 spacewalks back to back, which is a lot of work. And these guys, John and Rick, were saying the thank yous to the whole team because the people on we have famous jobs, but nobody knows the people anymore unless they do something nutso. And so they were saying thank you to the rest of the team, the people who had on the ground who had supported us all. And the bottom line was John did a great job. But then Rick had a short and kind of telling thank you. He said he wanted to dedicate the flight to one of his high school teachers who'd once told him that all he'd ever be good for is taking up space. Something about having the last word, and something about doing it on nationally broadcast radio television. Sleeping in space, okay, everybody does that in space. There's the Hubble after we left it, landed. I'd like to get to Russia. Although I'll just touch briefly on the pictures. You're probably aware that anywhere you look, even if it's really dark, like near the Big Dipper, where there aren't any stars, near the Big Dipper, near the North Star Polaris, there are no stars in that direction. You know, you're basically looking out of the plane of the galaxy and so on and so forth. And so the director of the Hubble Space Telescope put the Hubble Space Telescope and pointed it at a direction in which nobody had ever looked because there's nothing there to see. And what he did is he did that a number of years ago, and he was widely criticized until the results came back, which were galaxies, nothing but galaxies. Anywhere you look in the sky, it's galaxies. So as you probably know, 100 billion stars in our galaxy, 1 trillion galaxies in our universe. So there's a bunch of stuff out there. And that new camera was doing it in record time. Okay, just a quick photo montage. There's a lot of science in these that people study in order to understand things like how lakes shrink, the Aral Sea. It's way worse than that now. There's a whole lot less water there. Well, this is an interesting border. Does anybody recognize that border there? Egypt and Israel. Yeah, this is the dry side, the Egypt. That's the green side, Israel. Interesting. Does anybody recognize those? Your first flight, you always got to look for those, okay? Pyramids, Egypt. And Mount Everest. That was that first one I didn't really spend but a moment on. They teach you how to look for Mount Everest from one of these two here. I forget which one. Yeah, okay. So you can learn a lot about it. Now, if anybody doesn't believe in impact craters, the reason we're here today really is because of 98% species extinctions that occur every 65 million years or so, okay, on that kind of time span. And there's one of those impact craters that is clearly visible from space. Quick overview of the Russian space program, difference in how they do things. They integrate in the horizontal, by and large. They have a few rockets that have payloads that they'll do in the vertical, but their human spaceflight program integrates in the horizontal. They use the same launch pad that Gagarin launched off of. You'd be hard-pressed to find John Glenn's launch pad at the Cape. They roll theirs out on a train. There's the train. There's the rocket. That's how Ed Lu went to space. After the Soviet Union collapsed, they were broke. Some of the people didn't get paid for months. I guess if you've always been paid very little, you know how to live with very little. But can you imagine if your company went broke, you just kept going to work and launching things into space anyhow? And maybe someday they'd pay you. They did that in Russia. This is in Kazakhstan and Baikonur. You can see they're a little bit, as we call it, deferred maintenance. Okay? As long as the price of oil is above $18 a barrel, they're making a profit. So they're making a big profit right now, and we're starting to see new paint on the buildings in Baikonur. They're coming back. So that's how they get to the launch pad. It's pretty cost effective, I think. Pull it behind a train. I saw this. This is one of their acronyms. That's a K, a Russian B, an O, and an M. And so I said to one of the Russians, I said, you know, in English, we'd say kaboom. Okay, the Russians are very superstitious people. And he immediately assured me, oh, no, 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 no. That stands for the General Machine Building Company, okay, of Kazakhstan or something like that. But I said, but look here, it even looks like a boom, okay? And he insisted, no, 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 no. Okay, that's not it. They're very superstitious people. What they do, they continue to do if it worked. For example, on his way to the launch pad, Gagarin, anticipating the possibility of an extended wait, had the bus pull over to the side, and Ed Lu can affirm the veracity of this or not. And he stepped out behind the bus and did what you might want to do before you're going to sit down for a long time with no access to facilities. Every flight stops at the same place. Every bus going out to the launch pad stops at the same place, and everybody does the same thing. Even our women, even their women. They've flown, I think, 2 or 3 women on their Soyuz. Yeah, right, 2 women. And I think we've now flown just 1, but we'll fly some more on there. So basically, they don't fly a lot of women. We've flown almost as many of their women as they have. We've flown 1 on our shuttle, and they've flown 2 or 3 total in their whole program. So it's an interesting. But they do that every single flight. It worked. They're doing it again. OSHA doesn't work in Kazakhstan. What works in Kazakhstan is common sense. The first thing, actually, this is true in Russia, too. One of the first things they tell you is that your common sense plays an important part in your personal safety. You do not have the right of way on the street. The cars do. The bigger cars have more right of way than the little cars. Okay, and all the drivers know that. If a car decides to drive on the sidewalk, don't just look at it. Get out of the way. Okay? And it actually, they do drive on the sidewalk when they're in a hurry. They park on the sidewalk. That's the part I liked. I'm okay with parking on the sidewalk. That was a great thing. There, they have the same people doing the same jobs for many, many years. And they get to know them. They're held accountable, held responsible. If this guy gets hurt, he's out of a job. He might not have insurance. It's kind of socialized medicine, and you don't want to go into their medical system. They raise their rockets. They launch them. This is when a colleague of ours, Leroy Chow, went into space. They have a media circus right before launch. We at least give the crews a little privacy. They report to the state commission. They get on the bus. They report to another state commission. They go out. They do their thing. They launch. Up and away. For them, a landing is, in my opinion, barbaric compared to a shuttle landing. Because a shuttle, you land on concrete. And 45 minutes after you land, you're out. And a few minutes after that, you're in the hot showers back at crew quarters, visiting with your family. They send helicopters out because you're going to land in a capsule somewhere in these 10 miles of Kazakhstan. And they kind of know where those 10 miles are. If they're wrong, well, that's another story we don't have time for today. They've been wrong, and recently too. They usually just land a few hundred miles downrange if they go on a ballistic trajectory, and then they just search and rescue actually does their job and goes and tries to find them. It's apparently an egg beater of a reentry. Ed, it's an egg beater?
Nothing like a shuttle.
Nothing like a shuttle. This is apparently one of the most provocative reentries you can have. Provocative means you haven't been on the ground, so that semicircular canals you've got with the fluid at the bottom down here, that fluid floats around. You actually grow more cilia in there, so you're actually more sensitive to motion than before you went. And then you come back, the gravity comes on, the G's come on as you start slowing down. The fluid goes whoomp. You've turned the gain on high. A little head motion is like a big one. So all sorts of things can happen. There's those who adapt to space well and those who don't. There's those who adapt to reentry well and those who don't. Okay, and there's those who tell the truth about it and those who lie. Okay, so let's admit there's some readaptation going on in both directions, especially if you've been up there for 6 months. So that's a very provocative environment. After they egg beat you, they bring you down, and of course, you're going to hit the ground, and you're going to hit the ground, okay? They have these soft landing jets, they call them, but they give you a seat that strokes, whoop, okay, like that, in order to try to take up some of that shock, because you could get hurt. Then they actually come out there with the medical, portable medical tent, because they found you out there somewhere. They set up inflate a medical tent, the helicopters land. It doesn't matter what kind of time of year, really, because when it's time to land, it's time to land, and it just happened to be snow. One quick story on their weight of experience, and that was they once overshot their landing site and ended up in the Ural Mountains, in the winter, in the snow, in the mountains. And the crew went to get out of their cockpit, out of the capsule, and there's wildlife in those mountains, and included wolves. And the wolves appeared to be hungry. So they got back into the capsule, okay, and waited until the rescue forces showed up. And so after that, they said, gosh, if that sort of thing could happen, you guys need to have a gun, okay? So they gave them a sawed-off shotgun that doubles, my understanding, and Ed can tell you the truth, but according to popular lore, it doubles as a shotgun or as a flare shooter. So you can shoot flares with it, or you can shoot bullets of some sort or another. Is that fairly accurate?
Yeah, it's also got, you can also pull the handle off and shed it.
Ah, very good, in case you land in the jungles of Burma. Which could happen. You can land, once you're under a parachute in a capsule, you don't need concrete. So you do have more possibilities for where you can land. I'll give them that.
Didn't they have a cannon in one of their space stations?
Cannon. You mean like our nuclear pumped death ray laser? I doubt it, but I don't know. After they land, we get them out. It also turns out, once they get them out, there's the soft landing jets digging it up. It's good luck for the natives, the locals, Kazakhs, to find these returning, beings from the sky, and it's considered good luck to go and visit and to say hello. So the modern horse actually is a Toyota pickup, and so we've seen that out there at times as well. This is his daughter was born while he was in space, that particular American. Again, right after you come home, they end up subjecting you to this media circus, and it's like, just leave me alone, but smile for the camera, okay? There's his daughter who was born while he was up there. They do the traditional bread and salt ceremony of welcoming people back to Earth. Again, tradition. Just quickly, this is their shuttle. Now, some of the Russian files have been made public. And one of the neatest entries that I've seen transcribed is when they were designing their Buran. Let me go to a picture of a Buran. There's a picture of a Buran. And just for comparison, I'll allow you to contrast it with the picture of a shuttle. Now, and in the minutes of the Design Bureau's meeting, it says, can't improve on Americans' design, will use as is. Okay, and why would they do that? Well, did a whole lot of testing. We'd proven it works. It flies in space. Why does the shuttle have such large wings? Does a space shuttle need such large wings? It needs a pretty good sized tail because when it re-enters, it kind of has to come in like this. And so you need a pretty big tail to get the airflow onto it at about Mach 2.5. Below Mach 5, you need some air on the tail. But why do you need such big wings? NASA was originally in a partnership with the military. And the military put in a design constraint that said you need to have 750 miles of cross range. So if you're going in that direction, you're going to land in that direction unless you have some really big wings to push against the air and let you get out 750 nautical miles cross range from your down track, which is huge. Okay? I don't know that the Russians needed that. In fact, I don't think they did. But hey, the design work had already been done. So you think about reverse engineering and you think about, well, sometimes it makes sense just, and it's a lot cheaper just to do that. So they put theirs, you notice, I just bombed through there, but of course you have to launch in the vertical, but they do their integration in the horizontal. You hardly get high enough off the ground for it to be exciting, as opposed to a space shuttle where you're working hundreds of feet up off of the ground. And again, the safety issues that go with that. I'm not saying the way they do it's better, but it is different. They integrated their Energia in the horizontal. They put their shuttle on top of it. One story, though, just to let you know, engineers, the Russians are pretty good engineers. If you've ever been on their metro, you'll understand that, or seen the stuff they can build. This building had turned into a museum, and they had a Buran sitting on top of an Energia after they went broke, because they weren't able to spend the money to fly a shuttle. Only America has been able to afford that, because it's very expensive to fly a shuttle. The engineers determined that the building, the roof of the building was structurally unsound, and that they needed to go ahead and reinforce it. So the other, whoever the contractor was, loaded all of the building materials up on the roof in order to start fixing it. And the roof promptly collapsed. Okay, so unfortunately it collapsed right on top of this, one of the flight modules of the Buran. So they go out in the horizontal as well. So well, it's too big for one set of train tracks. So they just put 2 train tracks next to each other, which turns out is a little cheaper, I think, perhaps, than the way we do it. They then, and I'm not saying NASA's a jobs program, but if any of you are interested in a job, okay, we're looking for good people all the time, so keep that in mind. The 2 train tracks, they haul it out there, they raise it up. You can see the little cantilever things there that'll raise it up, and then it's time to go. They launched Energia with the Buran on it once, and it launched once before that, and it went up and away. They had a different philosophy than we did. We put a couple of guys named Young and Crippen on our first shuttle flight. The first flight of an untested rocket. Rockets will typically blow up in their first minute or make it completely to orbit. Challenger even fit 76 seconds, so about the first minute. Rockets tend to blow up in their first minute, or they're usually good all the way up. So they said, well, you know, rockets can blow up. We're not going to put people on ours. So they flew their first Buran unmanned. They landed it unmanned as well. So they had an auto land system that worked in the steppe of Kazakhstan and is a real threat to the pilot union in our country, I'll tell you that. Now we're into the political questions. What do we do with our space program? NASA had, I know what I felt like in the shuttle program, because when I grew up, I was watching people go to the moon. And I'm thinking, that's the job for me. I got to work for a living most likely, but what a great way to combine science and technology and doing something useful for the country and for the world, is my opinion of it. And so I decided to go in the space program. Of course, in the shuttle, we were just kind of going around the Earth. Finally building a space station. But what do we really want to do? There's an asteroid out there with our name on it. We hope for some gravity tractors. We hope for some neat ways of moving those things out of the way. But until then, don't have all your eggs in one basket. You want to live on Earth. Living in space is great, but it's not like living on Earth. Some things are easier in space. Some things are a lot harder. If you're typing on a keyboard, what do you have to do? You better strap yourself down because you're pushing on the keyboard, which pushes you away. So either strap yourself down or hook your fingers under the keyboard of the computer, strap the computer down, hold on to the computer, type away, sneak your thumb up for the space bar every once in a while, sort of thing. So some things are easier, some things are harder in space. And Earth is the place you want to live. This is a great place to live. It's fun to go into space. As soon as Branson gets his hotel in space, save up a lot, go. It's definitely the thing to do. I strongly recommend it. But we need to be somewhere else, most likely, so that we can recolonize Earth after that asteroid hits if we're unsuccessful in moving it out of the way. Simple as that. There's going to be a new couple of vehicles. The Russian model. Our previous model had always been launch the crew with their payload. But now we're separating our payload from our crew. And there's the escape tower. Enough of this killing astronauts thing. Okay, it turns out that there are plenty of astronauts willing to take that risk. So in all truth and honesty, what is the problem with losing a few people? How many people do we lose on our streets every year? What's the value of life? Okay, it's huge. You can't replace it. We consider it very valuable. However, people are willing to risk that in what they feel is a good cause, whether it's your firemen, your police officers, your military, whoever it is doing it, your astronauts. It's a good cause. We're willing to take the risk. Politically, it's unacceptable for some reason, and especially when the vehicle, the space shuttle, costs $5 billion to replace, and they're not going to even let us do that. It turns out, though, that if you take care of the hardware, if that's $5 billion, if you build the systems to make sure that the hardware gets home, you get the people home too. Okay, so that's one of the things to think about as you build things. Politically, you can't tolerate losing people. The truth is, we've always lost adventurers and explorers, and it's always going to be that way. And anybody who ever tells you that going into space is routine, they're not living in our time. As long as we are using chemical rockets to get into space, it's going to be a very challenging business. We really need some people to come up with some better ways to get into space. Please do that. This is what is important on this. This is an extraction rocket. It'll pull that capsule off of that stack and get it downrange under parachute away from the problem. The only time that this has ever been used was by the Russians. They were sitting on the launch pad one day. Tito, I think, was on that flight. And this young engineer named Sergei Krikalev, who hadn't even been selected into the cosmonaut program yet. What they would do in Baikonur is some of the young engineers, they'd sneak out, okay, into the blast damage area, really close where they weren't allowed to be. And he snuck out there with a couple of others. And they would watch the launches from really close. He said it was really cool. Okay? And one day they're sitting out there watching, sitting down in the step, pretty close to the launch pad. And they see a fire erupt at the base of the Soyuz launch platform. And apparently what happened was, and Ed may have more details than I do even, but the way I heard the story from Sergei was they couldn't manually eject themselves because they were radio comm to the ground, and the ground said there's a fire. And they couldn't eject their capsule. The ground control of the fire had burned through the cables, so the ground couldn't eject them manually either. So some smart controller, as the thing's getting ready to come apart, bounces a radio signal to a receiver that was able to command separation. And so, blammo, the extraction rocket works. They land down range a couple of kilometers. That night, the crew's, toasting with vodka. They're alive, okay? And they're programmed, since it's an assembly line, they fix the problem, they move on. While this is happening, there's 3 young engineers realizing that something bad is going to happen, okay? And one of them panics, jumps up, and runs. What comes from an explosion? A shock wave. Where do you want to be as a shock wave rolls over your position? Behind something. So Sergei jumps up, runs after this person, tackles them. They get behind some berm or something just in time as the shock wave goes rolling overhead. So it's been used but once, and it worked. So we're going to have them in the future too. We're not going to use fuel cells anymore. Interesting. Liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen, not going to use them. Going to go with solar cells. First thing you'll do is dock with the International Space Station. We're going to be 5 years without our own capability to get to space. We're going to rely on the Russians. We buy seats from the Russians. Right now, the cost is $30 million if you're a tourist. It used to be about $20 million, but you know the dollar's not doing very well overseas. The euro is doing pretty well. We negotiate long-term contracts, and we want the best price we can get. We used to trade flights, shuttle flights for Soyuz flights. Ed was originally scheduled to go up on a shuttle. He was going to come home on a shuttle. He went up on a Soyuz and came home on a Soyuz. That was part of the international agreements. But now we have to buy them because those are finished. And the Russians, they're very good negotiators, it turns out. There's some stories to tell you about that too. But we want the government price, and they want the commercial price. We don't call them the evil communists anymore. We call them the evil capitalists. They are taking us for as much money as they can get. And they're good at it. Same capsule may go to the moon, set up a moon base. It comes, here's a schematic as it comes apart. It re-enters the Earth's atmosphere like a capsule. Basically safe. Your worst ballistic entry is survivable from orbit. Well, you could go so steep that you'd just over-G it, but once you get on a relatively nominal re-entry, you're going to be able to survive it. We're probably going for water because that's easier. The Russians are actually as disappointed as we are that the space shuttle is going away. The nominal cost to orbit that we agreed upon national prices, international prices, are $10,000 a pound, $22,000 a kilo. Does it cost more or less to get things home from space? Turns out it costs a lot more. The shuttle is the only thing that can bring large equipment home from space. So it's a real truck. It's $30,000 a pound, 3 times as much to get things home as it is to get things to space by international agreement. Because we're the only ones who can do it. Basically, the Russians can bring home a few kilos in their little capsule, and that's about it. Nobody else has the capability for bringing things home. So it's and that's going to all go away. So it's going to be a very interesting time in 2010. If you want to go see a shuttle launch, I'd go soon. That's it. I'd be happy to stay and take questions. Y'all have been a great audience. I've really enjoyed chatting with you today. Thank you very much.